This is Jim Fetzer, your host on The Real Deal, with my very special guest today, Clare Kuehn, who hails from Canada in the Toronto vicinity. And Clare has proven to me to be a very astute student of, well, foreign affairs, domestic politics, JFK, 9/11, you name it. Clare's been there and has a lot of intelligent things to say, so I wanted to bring her on and share her with my audience. Clare, it's a pleasure to welcome you to the show.
It's a great pleasure to be on.
Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, as I described to you, I have a degree in medieval studies from the University of Toronto, which I did not take because of some odd interest in medieval politics. I did it because it's the only multidisciplinary degree they have where you actually take courses from the different departments. You go into classics to take your classics courses. You go into philosophy to take your philosophy courses, and so on. So it's a little closer to a real multidisciplinary degree like the old style degrees. And I also have a long history of being involved in art studies, being an artist, and sculpture, a little bit of 3D work in school on computers, that sort of thing. So that's a little bit about me.
Well, just to pick up on the art aspect, in conducting a graduate program at the University of Minnesota on the Duluth campus, I at one point invited faculty from different disciplines to provide modules for the graduate students. And I got to know a member of the Department of Art who was, two of them actually, but one in particular, Robin Roslack, who's into art history. And it was astonishing to me how much you can learn about the development of ideas, politics, science, technology through the study of art.
Exactly. And there's actually a couple of ways that you learn about it. And I guess it will tie into, if we go on about 9/11 and TV, fakery, those kinds of issues. One of the reasons that I took a degree was pressure from parents. Excuse me, I've been sick. And the other reason was that I like the history of the ideas. And ideas are concepts. And when you're an artist, you are moving concepts around, not merely objects. Every time you move an object, you've created a different, of course, perspective relationship, but also you're putting things together in a new pattern. And when you do that, you have a different scene. You can put objects in, they may fit emotionally, but not actually physically fit in the space, and those kinds of interrelationships are interesting. So when you're studying art history, you can study it as this is what the people were interested in. This is the subject matter that they did in their art and their philosophy and their science. They were obsessed with these ideas. And you can also, of course, just study it for the aesthetics, how people's actual sense of space changed, what they saw in space and time, at their point of time. So it's particularly interesting also because 9/11 relates to the idea of, are we in a Muslim-Christian crusade problem, which is what most people think. They're dealing with this almost, medievalist view. I never thought that my degree would have such relevance in my life. But, and in fact, of course, we're not. But they're using some of these old tropes. So what kinds of ideas do we take about the Islamic world? What kinds of ideas do they have about us? And some of those things are continuum. They don't change. So that's why, it has been interesting to have that degree.
Well, Clare, you have so much to say on so many topics. Let's talk with a recent one and then make connections backwards and so forth. There was this shooting at Fort Hood, which was a very strange event indeed, involving a psychiatrist, a guy who normally would be giving counseling to, troops who have post-traumatic stress, who don't want to go back, and it turns out that he is one of those who didn't want to go back, and he seems to have flipped out. And the fact that he appears to be a Muslim is something that I was fascinated to notice was not initially being emphasized by the press. So I'm just very interested in your take on what went on here. It's one of the more bizarre events of the last 2 weeks.
I'm glad you brought that up because it brings our sense of conspiratorial planning into the present. We have a lot of present events going on. Just before we go there, though, I'd like to, first of all, say a big hello to Jack White. I told him I'd send a hello out. And second of all, just a teeny story. As I told a girlfriend that I was going to be on the show, she told her boyfriend that who, what your name was, and he maybe I looked you up on Wikipedia and said, oh, a conspiracy nut. And I wanted to just simply say that Michael Parenti said a wonderful thing in one of his talks. He said, would you say someone's a Holocaust buff or a Holocaust nut for looking into those important issues? No, you wouldn't. These are important issues. So I just wanted to reaffirm at the beginning of the conversation how important I feel the issues we're discussing are and the approach we're taking to them. Because there may be people listening, maybe even he at some point who, might have that idea. Fort Hood is really interesting. As a matter of fact, it has come out now that there were reports on the day of the second place of shooting. There was another theater where there was a shooting that happened that has now been buried. Also, there were at least 2 other reported shooters on the day of that I think it was ABC and CNN both referred to until 10 p.m. that night. One was reported dead, 2 were reported taken into custody. And now it's all about this Hassan character. So those things immediately, to me, smell of a rat. That doesn't mean the early reports can't be wrong. But why are they just dropped and not, replied to? You know how this goes. If they've exposed it and said there weren't 2, we've discovered X, Y, and Z that they didn't exist, fine, but they just dropped it.
Yes,
sorry?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So already, boom, there you go. This is bizarre. He wasn't a psychiatrist, but the thing to remember about that is, having been, I think, in the Marines, right?
Yes. Marine Corps officer. I was a captain when I got out.
Yeah. Proud of you. I couldn't do it myself. Is that these people have clearances. People in those kinds of jobs, there's no messing around. We may think that they wanted to be nice to a Muslim guy who was talking about being rabidly anti-American, and he did a year before, or 2 years before, he'd given a PowerPoint presentation in which he said, we Islamists, we believe in, we love death more than you love life. He did this in a PowerPoint presentation.
The major did that, Claire?
Yeah, the Hassan.
Really? Did he really?
Yeah. It's like Lee Harvey Oswald, who was going around putting out pamphlets, of the anti-Castro Cubans, the pro, whichever it was.
He was for the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, which was
right.
encouraging, that the United States change its policy toward Cuba to treat Cuba more fairly, more even-handedly. But that was clearly part of the, sheep dipping him to give him a pro-Castro communist sympathizer persona, so when they pinned the tail on the donkey, they could claim Castro had been behind the assassination. It was supposed to lead to the American people being outraged and insist that the American military invade Cuba and take out Castro, but of course that did not happen.
Well, and of course you and I know this, but for someone who's the boyfriend of my friend, one should explain why that is so clear. All of his contacts at that point were like the Moranschild, who was a white Russian, right-wingy, anti-communist guy, of course coming out of the Russian emigre process, and he was linked to the CIA, happy to have America against Russia. So, and he never recruited anyone, and so clearly it was a putting himself out there as a kind of a, Now, this guy Hassan might have been a number of things. He may have been a bit fanatic, we don't know, but it certainly looks like this guy with high clearance is going around saying these things, and in fact, increasingly so as the year went on, and not having his clearance changed. In fact, he was involved in one of the security drills. I forget which kind, whether it was a FEMA or NHS or what kind of a drill, very shortly before this shooting happened. So the fact he did not lose his clearance, they're coming out now and saying, well, we were just afraid to, fire a Muslim. No, let's be realistic. These people, if you have any kind of you look like you're on the other side, and you're gone, right? There's another side to Hassan. He also came out of the Virginia Tech group, and Virginia Tech is possibly, looks very suspiciously like there's something odd going on, whether it's a mind control program, and we know that that's declassified. We know that goes on. Wouldn't have stopped in the 70s when they exposed it. And we had Cho, who was the shooter there, and shot himself, who's also an army, I'm sorry, I just got distracted. He was also an Army trained, or Army family and all this. And there have been 2 other students killed and another woman who was decapitated, a Chinese woman. So something strange is going on at Virginia Tech. It's possible that through the psychiatry program, he actually was somehow programmed or something. We don't know. And the other side to Hassan is, if he was a bit of a fanatic, he certainly seems to have thought he was part of the drill that day. A lot of people suggested that it may have been just another drill. They have a lot of drills at Fort Hood. He runs out saying Allah Akbar, which seems to be this Al-Qaeda script thing that they use in drills and used on 9/11. There's a lot of suspicious things about Hassan, about his behavior, his clearance, and of course multiple shooter reports. And the last thing I'll say is that the multiple shooter report of Governor Rick Perry talking on TV has now been removed off YouTube. I was going to, convert the file, but I was sick. And I thought, I know these things are disappeared. Well, it's gone now. So I didn't watch it. I can vouch for that if anyone, he's not the only one. There's a lot of stuff about the Fort Hood.
Well, the guy only had 2 handguns, even if one had a large magazine. I mean, over 100 people were shot or injured, and many killed, of course.
Exactly.
That's an awful lot of rounds, and with a handgun. And you're talking about targets who are themselves experienced military personnel who aren't just going to be passive and lie still and hope they don't get shot.
And they're combat vets. Somebody would have tried to tackle them, even if they had no weapons on them. This is ridiculous. And there was a second place in the shooting reported. So
yeah, tell me more. Tell me about that again.
I don't have all the details. If you want it, Tarpley, Webster Griffin Tarpley has written a footnoted piece, a 6 or 7-page footnoted piece that is on his website called actindependent.org. And it was Hassan a patsy or a drill gone wrong, ? The first few pages are by way of introduction, but then he gets into the substance of it. There's also a wonderful sort of summary piece, and let me just find it. And it's on. It's from the online journal, and it's called "Dying to Prosecute Hassan." So I think that if people want to look this stuff up, au courant, as it's going on, yeah, they should. I mean,
Claire, what do you think? What do you think is going on here?
Listen to. I mean, I have to quote Tarpley here, because he was just on the Alex Jones show for about 20 minutes yesterday, and he said some interesting things. He said, look, there seems to be a faction infight about whether to send these 40,000 more troops into Afghanistan.
Right.
And there may be kind of a push, whether from one element inside the government or the other, or even what he likes to call, or what we sometimes might call a rogue network, or someone above that position who wants conflict, so it could be something like that. It also could be morale. Morale is low about fighting these wars.
Go ahead.
It could be several things at once.
Kevin Barrett put out a newsletter, I think, only yesterday, saying he was very suspicious about moving these trials to New York, for example, that it was supposed to, bring back all of the memories of 9/11.
Yeah.
You combine that with a
Okay.
shooting. He's saying that the U.S. and Israel are both eager to attack Iran, though I find that difficult to imagine. In fact, the estimates have it that if there's an attack, even with conventional weapons on the Iranian nuclear facilities, that it will cause 1 million deaths outright, and the potential for, because of the contamination of the atmosphere moving through Afghanistan, India, and Pakistan, another 35 million early deaths due to cancer, leukemia, and all that. So I just can't imagine how anyone in their right mind could ever contemplate such a thing. It would be one of the greatest atrocities in human history.
Well, this brings me back to what I had emailed you about maybe starting with, which is discussing conspiracy and the levels of understanding that entails. Because there seem to be many layers that we can talk about when we use that term.
Yeah.
And it seems to be bandied about a lot. So I'd like to go, first of all, to the root word.
Sure.
The root word, and it still has this meaning, and it's a fuzzy meaning, but it's usable. What it means is to breathe together. It means to have a spirit that is in common. So you can use that for any action. You can actually describe any grouping of people as conspiring in that sense. Because of that, when we're tracing perpetrators of a specific, more limited conspiracy action, like somebody doing something that's morally or legally wrong, and they're conspiring in the way we usually talk about that, you can follow the general banner issues. You can follow it as a nation. You can say Americans this, or British that, or whatever. You can also, of course, say men this, women that, whites have a conspiracy against blacks, etc. And there's a truth in it. What it is it's the truth of the general agreeing of most people of some of the banner ideological points. And then those points can be used by the more sadistic or the more lazy or even a more organized network to do bad things. And so in one sense you can say the whole thing is a conspirant. And if you put your lens on to that, you can see that. But if you're going to find perps, you're going to find them among that group for that banner. But as you and I know, any group can also be used by another group as a dupe. So you might have, let's say, a general feeling of might is right among the British Empire, but then the British Empire could be used through Dutch diplomacy to do something that helps the Dutch, so then they're actually acting in Dutch interests. And you get these layers to conspiracy. So you have big and small, you have general and specific, and you also have factions using other factions. And all of that is bandied about when we talk conspiracy. And the word changes meaning. This is a teacher of logic. If your definition is changing as you're using it, you're not really being specific about the
No, what you're doing is you're committing a fallacy of equivocation, because what you're saying might be true in one sense but false in the other. And, of course, as you're observing, conspiracies are as common as apple pie. All they require is two or more individuals collaborate together to bring about an illegal end. I think that the mileage has got out of the use of the word theory, which is characteristically used in the trivial sense of a rumor, speculation, a guess. So you say conspiracy together with theory, and you get a rumor or speculation or a guess, and then there's this tendency to exaggerate that a conspiracy has to involve vast numbers of people. I got some books for an article that I haven't finished writing on the nature of conspiracy theories, where they're talking about having to have vast numbers and even making it inherently untestable, so that there's no way that you can refute a conspiracy theory. But if you in fact are very specific about it, take the government's own conspiracy theory about 9/11. Those of us who have been studying the government's own account have been able to refute it on virtually every single major claim the government has advanced. So that, the research that I have done in putting together the best qualified individuals to ever study the assassination of JFK was specifically intended to take rumor, speculation, and guesswork out of the study of the assassination and place it on an objective and scientific foundation. And that's been the purpose, too, of my study of 9/11, because, Claire, after all, as you well know, we have this other very significant notion of theory in relation to the atomic theory of matter, the theory of relativity,
yes,
Newton's theory of gravitation, where we're talking about an empirically testable explanatory hypothesis.
which is also constructed in a specific way.
Yes.
It's constructed in a way which excludes, it actually makes sure that the terms are not equivocated, and it constructs them so that what we know exactly what we're speaking about as much as possible, and we then put those pieces together in a way that show that other possibilities are excluded, and this is the hypothesis that should be gone for. And that's one thing, that theories have a process. They actually have a logical consistency that is different for different theories, but that, as you know, there's a logic to how you create it, and it's not merely a mental act. But I want to come back to the issue of conspiracy just for a moment, because very, very important. There are many things we mean by conspiracy, and they all have their benefit. We mean, of course, two people conspiring for an illegal act. I would add, or immoral. Not all things are illegal at a time when they're done. We also, of course, have it as I say, I've heard people say, there's a conspiracy against me. I'm a fill in the blank, right? Yeah. And they're also right, because they're not trying to say every single individual is all of the other group is always planning something against them. But they're saying that there's a general benefiting, a general groupthink, and it's set up in opposition to their group. I mean, every group has that a little bit. And so potential actions are possible. I see it as a swarm. I see it like a swarm of bees. You can have bees coming in and out. You can have, I'm not realistically speaking, you can have hives of other bees coming in. You can have the swarm changing shape. But generally speaking, you're dealing with, if you're not the bee, you're dealing with an us versus them approach. And that is sometimes what people are talking about when they're tracing conspiracy actions, which you were mentioning, specific conspiracy actions. They're talking about, well, we have to follow the guy who sold the balloons to the guy who sold the donuts, to the company who, because actually, though those people don't actually participate necessarily directly in the planning of what's going on, those people are traceable as part of the process that got the thing done, or they're part of the general assumptions of the culture, and therefore they're part of the conspiracy if you put one lens on, and they're not part of the prosecutable conspiracy if you put the other lens on. And when you read about conspiracy theories on the internet or in books, you often find this, it's everywhere and nowhere, so you can't prosecute it. And then the other people are saying, it's so specific that it's ridiculous. And so they're each attacking the other meaning of the equivocated term based on, they're not taking it for what its value is. They're not taking it for as good as it is. They're actually opposing.
You want to relate this back to your friend who looked me up on Wikipedia and decided I was another conspiracy nut?
Yeah, but I mean,
I've been called worse, Claire. I've been called worse.
Well, it's horrible because these are important issues, and it's so clear that anyone who is looking at anything negative now is obviously looking at a group of people doing something negative. And if it's a societally put down issue, if you're not supposed to talk about that issue, then it falls into conspiracy.
Claire,
it isn't...
Yeah. I have a real simple... Go ahead.
If it isn't put down by the society, then it's almost like, it's just a business plan. They're just crooks. You see, so we're using the term only for those things that are not societally accepted. I'm sure that the fellow thought he was being cool and having someone to put down. The problem is the more we have citizens doing that, the less they're asking questions about the general problems that we have.
Claire, we're going to take our first break, but I just want to say, next time you see him, ask him this question from me: how does he know I'm wrong? This is Jim Fetzer, your host on The Real Deal, with my very special guest today, Clare Kuehn. We'll be right back.
Even Bush admits that Saddam Hussein had nothing to do with 9/11. Our own FBI acknowledged it has no hard evidence that ties Osama bin Laden to 9/11. But if Saddam had nothing to do with 9/11, and if Osama had nothing to do with 9/11, then who did it? Who did it? The 9/11 conspiracy provides the answer. Discover the big picture. Learn what we know now. Find out what it means. 11 experts contribute to exposing the truth as the anatomy of an atrocity. Edited by James H. Fetzer. Buy it now if you have the courage to face the truth. Just don't think you're going to like it. The 9/11 conspiracy provides the answer.
This is Jim Fetzer, your host on The Real Deal, with my very special guest today, Clare Kuehn from Toronto, Canada. Clare has a vast background, in my estimation, and a tremendously synthetic intellect, which enables her to put things together that most people just don't see. She's been suffering from a cold of late, so we're going to cope with that, but it's such a pleasure to have her on the show. Clare, I just want to reiterate how happy I am to have you here today.
Thanks, and I'm really happy to be your friend.
Let's turn whether you think we ought to. I mean, we got the assassination of JFK, of course. The observance is the 46th observance is on Sunday, the 22nd, and it provides some kind of background in relation to events since then. And I just wonder if you'd like to offer any of your views about, connections between JFK, 9/11, and all that.
I definitely would. As a matter of fact, because we're going to at some point, among other things, hit, I hope, on 9/11 video issues. I'd like to, first of all, mention John Costello's work. I've listened to many of your broadcasts, almost all of them, from this new show, and almost never are the specific proofs. Do you go over them, or does anyone go over them? Although I'm so delighted you put up the actual Duluth conference now, Duluth 2003, on YouTube, so anyone should check that out, especially Costello's talk. But the most important thing that I found that Costello did, that a lot of people don't do in their own work, even Jack White, I'd like to see him do this a little more, is on Assassination Science, I think it is, your website, assassinationscience.com, somewhere in one of those sublinks, is John Costello's discussion of the debunkers of his work.
Yes.
He goes into what they claim. Now, it's a little bit back and forthy and a little bit, a little personal, but most of it is specific to what they say that his work had flaws in, and he shows why they either had straw men, it was incompetent, or, and we use this term straw men from logic, meaning that they're not dealing with the issue that was in fact on hand that he was dealing with, that they're dealing with some sub-issue, or they're incompetently doing their work and that they have not debunked it. And I think that that's important for people to know that I personally go on the internet now a lot. I used to not at all. And one of the things I notice, a lot of videos, or people will call their videos humiliation or gotcha. And a lot of these people, even if they're well-intentioned, they're sometimes wrong. And they're coming across as like, haha, we showed you. And the original provers don't come out and say, no, see, you've actually proved this, but that demonstrates nothing about what I'm saying because of what I did. So Costello actually does that. He does it verbally, and there's many pages where he responds to the JFK Forum, I think it is, and all those people. John Costello's proofs, his simple proofs, are two kinds. One he's talking about the faking, the absolute nature of proof, and he's also talking about the faking composite nature of the Zapruder film that most people who know JFK, his death, they have seen that film. And what he says is, look, when you correct for lens distortion, and there is lens distortion, and you compare it to photographs from right after the assassination, and he did all that composite work with photographs from 1963, and you angle, using a computer now, you can easily do it. You can angle two frames so that they have the same viewpoint. So let's say as you're panning, your actual viewpoint is sort of, you're looking out and it's changing. But you have the same objects in the frames, mostly. You can angle the frames so that they're actually aligned, so that any objects that haven't moved, like a building, whatever, they can be seen from the same angle, and he can do that. And then he finds that the sign, the Stemmons Freeway sign in the foreground, doesn't match itself. It's actually not matching itself. It goes off on an angle because it was too straight before the lens correction was done. And so now it goes off on a weird angle. But it also doesn't match its own self in multiple frames. And that's not a proof if you haven't done the point of view correction. Of course, it's not going to match itself in every frame. All of the different perspective lines will be different. But when you match the background buildings to themselves, you find that the Stemmons Freeway sign does not match itself. And that means that unless it moved by 6, 7 inches and tipped, and then went back and tipped, and was not a stationary object, it is an impossibility within the film frames themselves as a physical object would be represented. That's number one. And he also does it with the lamppost that comes across the frames, that it's tipping significantly. And it's tipping by the amount of degrees that the lens distortion is. So he says that proof shows that somebody added those pieces into the film after the rest of the film had its lens distortion. Now, that may be a natural thing. It was an camera original, and they were just adding these things in. Or it may not be. So then he says, all right, that's an absolute proof that those objects were added in. That's already faking or adding. The second thing he says is there's one frame in the middle of other frames where the middle's moving, and so where it's almost a stop-motion frame, where the blurring almost doesn't exist. The car isn't moving in relation to the background isn't being panned in relation to the car, and the Stemmons Freeway sign is off. And unless that camera shutter came down in an absolute stop motion for that one frame out of 400 or whatever it is, that's an impossibility too, because that means that you have a very quick shutter speed suddenly, and then all the rest of the frames are normal. That one isn't as absolute because you could stretch it and say there was a glitch in the camera that made it a perfect frame. But combined with the fact that Stemmons Freeway sign is off, and combined with, of course, all sorts of other proofs, there are other proofs. These are absolute. This means the film had a background, a middle ground, a foreground. Any one of those pieces of the final image could have been altered, could have had multiple frames added to effectively slow down the final image. And the final thing that of course, is but most of your listeners won't if they haven't looked into this, is David Healy has done a study of how this was done. And I've worked in a darkroom. I've worked on still pictures. And, you create a physical mat out of cardboard. You block the light as it's coming down from the projector, and only what your paper is getting exposed to the light with is what will show. You can also bend your paper so that it will create a smooth distortion, and there's all kinds of things you can do. That's individual photographs. Well, when you're working with film, or you're working with an individual piece of video, like a split second of a video, because that's a single frame, you can do any of these things to it. And David Healy says we would mount these big cameras onto what had been a bed from a printing press. And I've worked on printing presses. They're very stable and they resist earthquakes and so on. They take all that stuff off. They're cleaned as perfectly as the machining can get it. And they put these cameras on and they shoot them through prison or through air or whatever. They can do frame by frame. They can have maps. They can have painting, whatever. And the final camera that's facing all that image in the air is called a an optical printer. Now, for a long time, I found that quite complex. I didn't understand printer. What they mean is the light is imprinting itself on the film, so you can get caught, mistake that. He doesn't quite explain that. But what it means is it's actually an optical, it's almost like a final image process that's taking the composite film. It's called an optical printer, but it's not doing the printing of the film. It's doing imprinting with light onto a final film. You can slow it down, you can back it up, and so on. Now, this is important. This is important for a number of issues when we're dealing with all conspiracy that involves making any kind of image. The problem is, as I was thinking about it just yesterday when I was sick, when you have an image, you are not only creating a myth. Most people think of it that way. We're creating a story by having a film. You're also excluding other possibilities. And you made the point, what was left out of the film is as important as what's put in. And what is implied by the myth leaves certain things out conceptually. If you have a nice car that comes around Lee Plaza corner there, I forget what it's, Houston on to Elm.
Houston on to Elm, yes. Corner. Yes.
Yeah. And there's a splice there, right, which would have, according to witnesses, shown the driver of the limousine carrying John F. Kennedy and John Connolly and of course, wonderful Jackie. They took a wide left turn. And this is, okay, a car might take a wide left turn. But by leaving it out, doesn't even enter into your personal sense of what went on. I have to use an emotional term here because it does come down to an emotional sense. And then you will be resistant to anything that says your emotional sense is off. So the thing about fakery is, or altering an image is so important. And it also, I think, is a key to both of the assassinations. Well, I guess not a lot of it's an assassination. In a way, both of these murders is that in both instances, if you cut through what the films are saying, you immediately find a lot of different answers. It's quite quick. It's almost like beeline to the problems. And the only difference is, as you pointed out, Lee Harvey Oswald was in Neely Plaza. What people were saying TV fakery and 9/11 are saying usually is they were likely no Boeing. So it's like saying Lee Harvey wasn't even there. That's the only real difference. Other than that, they both are very quick. Suddenly you have to ask, well, what are the physics of the buildings? Or what were the physics of the ballistics in JFK's murder? And it's interesting to Mark Lane and all these other people, they've worked out a lot of these other things. But you cut through the film, and immediately you're there. It's a very quick access. And I think it scares a lot of people that it's so quick. You can't argue anymore that all of the fuzziness around having to understand the whole assassination is necessary. You don't. You say the film's a fake. They have hundreds of witnesses that say this. You got to go with the witnesses. It's a very quick access. Does that make sense?
Yes. I just love hearing you talk about it.
Oh, okay. Oh, dear. The other thing that's different about the two events is that the Zapruder film finicking went on, and it did. At this point, I tell people there is no doubt, and I give them one or two quick examples, and I say, sorry, that's the way it is. And I've found people usually don't fight me then. They don't actually, they go, because you either then have to emotionally accept it, or not. There's not really a leeway on that. A wonderful visual, quick thing to say, now we can get at what really happened, or as close as we can get at it. Let's have a discussion. But there is a difference between the two. The Zapruder film and the Mormon and all these things that came out after, and I was surprised how long it took them to get these images, because I was born in the 70s. And by the late 80s, and hearing about these things, a lot of the materials were out, right? So I kind of assumed they'd come out around the time of the assassination. Actually took a lot of Freedom of Information Acts, a lot of effort, and a lot of, releases to get these things. And but it was not done before the assassination. The thing about 9/11 TV fakery that I'd like to get into, and I would like to spend some time on this if it's okay with you, it's quite complex, is that it had to have been already set up and done beforehand. Not the footage of the actual towers burning, but the setting up the shots had to be done ahead of time, because it was already being broadcast in the moment of. And that means that any problems with those films were you could add the plane in, but there are things about those images that had to have been set up beforehand. That is a critical difference. That means not only was the media directly complicit, there were elements that knew ahead of time. It wasn't just cover up after, which is a little different than setting up the people to fake the Zapruder film. This is almost like having the Zapruder film ready to go. There's a little bit of that element in 9/11 that is not there in the JFK murder.
Which element again, Claire? I mean, I understand about you're saying in 9/11 they had to prepare the videos of the planes hitting the building in advance so they could run them in close to real time. You're exactly right, and that's an astute observation. But you're saying there was something else about the witnesses, is it?
No. I was saying that's what I was saying. I was saying that if the images themselves are composites on 9/11, if the images are not merely added planes, which can be added in the sense of, now that applies to the people ready to add them in, but if the images themselves are composites that do not work optically on 9/11, that has to be set up with multiple cameras and a computer interruption beforehand. They have to already have a command center that's doing this stuff. It isn't like somebody in the 17 seconds adding in a plane. I'm just thinking absolutely logically about this, like, to a fine point. Because the Zapruder thing probably was set up beforehand. The people were ready. They would have had to have known that they were going to try to get films and stuff like this. They may have done some of the footage ahead of time when there are shadow problems in some parts of the Zapruder film that suggest that it was taken earlier in the parts that were taken earlier in the day. But the actual compositry of the film, the Zapruder, was done after, whereas the images had to be already composite when broadcast. It's the composite.
I think this is a very important point you're making. I'm very glad to have you articulate this so clearly. I like it.
And so I'd like to actually talk about the fact they are composites, because this is something that will...
do.
This will either make me friends with everybody for clearing this up, or it'll make me no friends, because there are a little bit of problems with everybody's wonderful work. And I want to say, I know you've had problems with Ace Baker, and I want to say thank you to Ace for his work. I want to say thank you to Rosalie for her work. I want to say thank you to Jeff Hill for his phone calls, and Simon Shack, if he ever listens, and Genghis, and all these people, all of them, for doing what they're doing. Okay, but because it's moved me. I am truly moved by these people. However, okay, what Simon Shack put out there suggested some problems in the parallax. And I know that people maybe don't know what that is. That's two perspective points of view compared. It could be your right eye and your left eye, or it could be when the Earth is in the spring or the Earth is in the fall on one side or the other of the sun, and they measure how far a star is by comparing where the star rises to. And that is, in fact, the proof that we're going around the sun. That's how they did it. They finally did it, I think, in 1830. They proved Kepler's and Copernicus's point of view that the Earth was going around the sun by using parallax, because the Earth will be on one side of the sun at one point and one side of the sun at the other point. And measuring the distances of how the stars appear with very fine instruments, they only had in the 1800s or 1780s or something, and finally proved it physically. Okay? So parallax means a comparison of two views. All it means, and objects will shift in your view. Stationary objects don't move, right? That's the position of stationary. But they move in your point of view. And of course, we all know this. You go around something and they stretch. They seem to move to your left or your right. It's actually you who is moving, but all the angles shift and everything. So in a given frame, it's called perspective, single point perspective or 4-point perspective, whatever. But comparing two different views is called parallax. That's what it is. Now, Jeff Hill, who's done all those wonderful phone calls, and I mean, I had listened to them, I'm floored. He came out on a 9/11 page here. Let me just see what it was, and I did it down. Yes, 911scholars.ning.cm, I think I have.
.com. Yeah.
/forum/topic/no-proof-of-video-fakery. Right? And that's the thing. And
you can find it by just going to the 911scholars.ning.com and do it in a search. Put in probably SHURE, which is part of his handle, and you'll find it.
You can, although I always find that more awkward because then I don't know which of all those listings I'm supposed to look at, so that's why I looked that up.
Fair enough.
And he listed a whole bunch of videos, and he says, where's the proof of that video fakery? Here's a bunch of them debunked it. So I went on. And what I found was very, very interesting. One of the things was an s1.zetaboards.com/pump-it-out/topic/1722486/1/. And there he compares what Simon Shack says are two different trajectories of the planes in two different shots shown that day. And he says they're the same swerve. They're actually the same swerve. One shows a swerve from high and then low and flat and straight. The other one is from a different angle, and it shows high and swerve, and it looks like it's banking. Brilliant work. There is a problem with that. The problem with that is that although the trajectories are the same, and that could have been done with computers, the one that seems to be banking is very big and very dark through the whole banking. It actually is too dark and big for having been so far away at the start of the banking. So for instance, you have this banking long in from one view, and then you have this foreshortened perspective, the foreshortened banking it down. And it is still a problem because the plane is too big. So again, it isn't banking any more than it was. It's a brilliant comparison, but it's too big for being seen from where it would have been so far away, like a mile away when it starts banking. In the second image, it's supposed to be a lot further away. It doesn't take a long time to come in and, then get very, very, very big. It's pretty big and it banks. So they've added that on the right trajectory, the wrong timing and the wrong, darkness. There's a second thing that he put up, and I'm going to run with these very quickly because I want to get to parallax for a moment. There's a wonderful little study by Ace Baker where he takes Google Earth and he shows that the towers close up in Google Earth, and the Verrazzano Bridge, it's called Verrazzano Bridge, right, is very, very small, far away, and he's sort of like about a mile away, I think, in Google Earth at that point. Then he pulled back, pulled back to five miles away in viewpoint. And now I'm trying to remember at what point. I think it's 5 minutes and 29 seconds or something. There's a glitch. And then when he zooms back in from 5 miles away, so now he's blowing up what he sees from 5 miles away. This is now just a camera change. It's not a physical movement forward in Google Earth. Suddenly the Verrazano Bridge is very big against those towers. And the irony is, he has not, in fact, proved that the Verrazano Bridge would be bigger on a zoom from 5 miles away. He's shown that Google Earth itself has a glitch at that point. He's actually proved the case that Google Earth was used. Because suddenly, when you're 5 miles away, the Verrazano Bridge is even bigger against the towers than it was when you were 1 mile away. This is actually a physical optical impossibility.
God, that's
he's actually ironically proved the case that it was fake. But he's showing it to say, see, when I zoom in from 5 miles away in Google Earth, it is bigger. The Verrazano Bridge is something like 40% the size of the towers. And when I was 1 mile away, it was only, I don't know what it was, 20% or 10%. And optically, when you move further away, things all get smaller and they all become a dot. But if you could see that dot, they would stay in the proportions that they were. They would actually, you would never get something bigger in the background than in the middle ground from moving away from it. The only way to do that is to move towards it and towards it and towards it, and then gradually it will become bigger in your frame. So the proportional relationship there actually shows that Google Earth had a glitch and that it was likely the thing used. Ironic.
Claire, this is quite brilliant. I love it. We got to take a break. We're going to be right back with my special guest, Clare Kuehn. This is Jim Fetzer, your host on The Real Deal. Stand by.
We can now say, with moral certainty and considerable scientific authority, that the death of JFK was committed by a meticulously executed conspiracy which was obscured by an extensive cover-up. Murder in Dealey Plaza, edited by James Fetzer, goes to the heart of the JFK assassination. You'll read new and up-to-date information regarding the Secret Service, the Lincoln limousine, the medical evidence, the cover-up, altering the film, framing the patsy, and the silent historians. Also, 16 smoking guns, each one crushing the government's lone assassin scenario. A world-class chronology of November 22nd, 1963. Chapters by David W. Mantic, Gary Aguilar, Vincent Palomera, Douglas Weldon, Jack White, Ira David Wood III, James H. Fetzer, Doug Horn, and a classic essay by Bertrand Russell. The complete story in the pages of one single book, edited by James H. Fetzer. Read it now. Read it again. You'll use it as a reference. Murder in Dealey Plaza. Available at Amazon.com and major bookstores around the world. It's murder.
This is Jim Fetzer, your host on The Real Deal. With great pleasure, returning to continue my conversation with Clare Kuehn from Toronto, who's doing a masterful job of covering a wide variety of issues, some of which are among the most complex confronting the research communities in both the case of the JFK assassination and 9/11. Clare, please continue. I love it.
Okay. Well, I should have actually started with a little overview for people who don't know this stuff. There are many problems with these videos. Ms. Wilson Grable has masterfully, early on, identified problems like missing, it looks like skipping or missed frames in the Naughty Brothers film, hints of there's all kinds of stuff. And when we were talking about parallax issues, a fellow named Simon Shack did a study called September Clues. I'm just going over this for a second for those who don't know. Called September Clues, in which he compiled a number of things that looked really bad And some of them are less absolute, some of them are more absolute. There are other people like Ace Baker, ACE Baker, B-A-K-E-R, who did studies on, and others who have done studies on the way the planes seem to mold into the buildings, as though with almost no slowing down, no parts breaking off. And of course, a plane has its wings, back. I mean, it's like put your arms back. And so the front has gone in, and the wingtips are still out, but the building is still there in the gap when it's gone through. The hole isn't there yet. So these sorts of things, there's also, of course, we're talking about different trajectories. There's a claim that there's different trajectories. And I think it was Jeff Hill himself, I'm not sure, who did that trajectory issue I was talking about, where compared to trajectories, they look okay. But there's that other problem with it. There are helicopters that show up in one video, don't show up in any of the other at the same time, or show up for only 5 seconds and then disappear. There's all kinds of problems with these videos, so I just wanted to give that overview that this is what we're talking about. So move on to the parallax issue from the Mazzano Bridge. Just before I do, there's another study of the Verrazzano Bridge that's out there, and I think it's, did I write it down? Moving Bridge. It's on youtube.com/watch?V equals NH8H, Y4VANIE, I think. Anyway, you can look it up as Moving Bridge. Now, this is interesting because this person has done an excellent little study, and it shows that the towers have the same relationship to one another. There's one in front, one behind, same proportion of the scene, one scene behind. And yet the Verrazzano Bridge is way off to the right. And then after a few moving of the viewpoint around and camera stuff, they come back to the exact same proportional relationship of those two buildings. So now we're back to the same perspective. However they crop it, we're back to the same viewpoint. And now the Verrazzano Bridge is moved in quite considerably. So what they've done is they realized that it can't be over that far. And somebody else did a video called Humiliation on YouTube. I won't go into that. It's a long, one of those YouTube long, meaningless string vendors. But this person very, hostily, basically is saying, well, we see in other shots that the camera's moving around the buildings. Well, that's straw man argument, because what this person who did that Verrazzano Bridge study did is they showed that without having moved the camera in relation to those twin towers, the Verrazzano Bridge moves. They actually show that you start with the towers in a certain perspective relationship to themselves. They did wonderful comparison because they were so close together. You can tell if one has moved behind the other in your view because you moved around them. And from the front of the clip to the back of the clip, the Verrazzano Bridge has moved. So it's not that the camera has moved around the towers. So this person who did a Humiliation is using a straw man. They're saying, well, when you do move around the towers, the bridge will move. But that's the example wasn't that. It was when it doesn't actually change. So anyway, I'll move on from the Verrazzano Bridge, but it does bring us to parallax. Simon Shaggs, unfortunately, fairly quickly goes through some of these parallax problems. And you really have to pause his work. A lot of it is in part 9. I think some of it is in part 3 or 2 or something. You'd have to find it. What he shows is that, again, without the towers in proportional relation to one another, so if you take tower 1 in front, whichever one that is, at 100%, and the other one, it becomes 50% of that. So we're only dealing with proportional relationships. You find that the buildings in front of them flip-flop around. The buildings in front all do flip-flops. The middle ground doesn't change, and the background doesn't change. So what we're saying here is that although the front flip-flops, the middle ground should change too. If you have moved your ocean to something in the foreground, your middle ground will shift a little less in your view. These are stationary objects, so they're not physically changing like the limousine and JFK. They're just changing your viewpoint. All the angles will change, and their proportional relationship of how far away they see in the picture view will change. But the background will change far less. It will change far less. And there is no change from one clip to the other in some instances. What that means is compository. That actually means that somebody has had theirs. And although this is an issue that I know Rosalie Grable said, oh, the parallax issue, it's not an issue. And she's been on about the Naude film, and she's right. In the Naude film, there's no problem with parallax. And Ace Baker, of course, has said to me on an email, that doesn't matter. The planes aren't real. What I'm getting at here is that if the images themselves, just as with Costello's proof, if the images themselves are composite, it's a direct proof that it's likely outings are wrong. People can argue forever as to whether that blob on John F. Kennedy's head was painted in or not. It clearly was if you get it, but some people could argue forever. But if the images are composite, they throw everything else into doubt. They show a much bigger element of myth-making, of storytelling, and of leaving out, of also conspiracy, physical conspirators, than just having an argument about a blob or a plane. So it's important to know that if the images were composites to start with, then they've had to be done in a hub center for the media. A lot of people have asked me, and they say, what about all the witnesses? Well, what about them? At that point, it doesn't matter what the witnesses who say they saw it exactly as it happened on the screen say, because the screen was lying. You can no longer hold that position and be reasonable. You have to explain those other things some other way. So back to the parallax issue. There is a video that's called Parallax for You, at 4 numbers, 4 and then you, the number 4. And Jeff Hill refers to this in that Scholars blog. And it's, I will give this one because it's short. It's youtube.com/watch?VeQQPUW4UASCEA. And the person there claims that parallax exists all the time. So what's the problem? Simon, you're an idiot. Of course parallax exists, meaning there are different shifts in angles every time you look at something. That's another straw man. Simon is saying, of course, it exists and it's wrong. He's not saying parallax is not a physical thing that happens optically. He's saying that it's wrong in these optics. It's a different issue. So they go in Parallax for You, they botch a number of things. One of the things, though, they do is Building 7, which is, came down to 37-story building that wasn't hit by a plane and very odd. One of the viewpoints that Simon shows has an angle to building, and it's coming down at an angle, right? And the person in Parallax for You says, well, you see, from another angle view, it shows that the building came down with just a little ballooning there, and that might account for the angle that Simon is showing from the other clip. But Simon isn't saying that. Simon is saying that, imagine this, Jim, you have a straight block, right, the rectangular tall building, I mean height, and it falls into its footprint, which it shouldn't do physically anyway, as we know. The parallax angle, if you stay straight, it will stay the same. It will fall with all points falling straight in your view, right? They will be at a different angle depending on where you're standing, but they will all fall consistently straight. Now imagine that a building is actually narrow at the top, even a pyramid. As the pyramid falls, the top point of the pyramid is coming down, right? And the angle starting might be a 45-degree angle, which it is with the Greek pyramid, for instance. As it falls, it will become a shorter and shorter and shorter triangle as it comes down. It will not fall with the side remaining at 45 degrees to the original height. It will not come. It's hard to describe. I wish I knew how to make a video to show it. But you will basically have you will have an angle, but that angle will swerve in your view as it comes down. That doesn't happen in this video that Simon is showing. Thing 7 seems to come down as though one is on a landslide and the other side stays straight. Well, in fact, of course, it would begin to be narrower and narrower and narrower as the frames go down because you're getting less and less of the building. It is actually narrower at the top. And we know, of course, Building 7 wasn't narrower at the top. So it can't happen where you have one right angle and another oblique angle in your view from any point of view, that where they stay consistent as they fall, and they just fall like that, it would actually create a smaller and smaller and smaller image, or it would fall together. But you can't have two angles like that staying stable as it falls. So this is another thing that they don't really handle. And it's frustrating for me, I just have to say as a sideline, how people can feel they're debunking something when they're actually taking a side angle on it, or they're even doing a wrong aspect. They misinterpreted what the point was. And then it goes out there as a kind of a truth. So I say to Jeff Hill, there is proof of video fakery. There's actually a lot more proof of it. But these are the issue here is compositing. So what I do when I speak to people, like at work, if I'll bring this up, I say, look, they faked the images on 9/11. They used real footage, but they combined it, used other things. They seem to have used Google Earth. And the people say, what? And I say, and I use the fakers thing first. I say, well, there's a plane that goes right into the building where there's no hole yet, and then the hole happens. And there's no wake.
Claire, are you there?
There's my card. When I note on the card, they said it at 3.5 hours on the card. I'll have to very briefly call you back and get on the new card. Can you do that?
Yeah, sure. We'll just take a break. We'll take a break now, and you call me back, and I'll get you back on. Thanks very much, Claire.
Okay, I'll be right back.
You got it. Bye now.
Stem cell research, abortion, cloning, evolution, creation science, intelligent design. These are hot-button issues today. Religion and science, morality and government, corporations and fascism. If you want to know what's happening to this nation this very day, then you won't want to miss Render Unto Darwin. After 35 years of teaching logic, critical thinking, and scientific reasoning, Jim Fetzer offers a critique of the Christian rights crusade against science. If you want to understand the issues, if you want to be informed, this is a book you won't want to miss. Render Unto Darwin at Amazon.com and the major bookstores. Render Unto Darwin.
This is Jim Fetzer, your host, welcoming you back with my special guest today, Clare Kuehn. Claire, I would conjecture this probably because you're using a cell phone, so the charge was much higher than you thought. If you'd been calling from a landline, it probably would have been just plenty.
I'm on a calling card, and the 5 o'clock is the actual time when the evening minutes start.
Ah, so you were early. Late.
Yeah, I was actually fine. It's no problem. I'm just sorry about the interruption.
There's no problem at all because we just took our last break. We'll just run continuous right up to the top of the hour. So, you were talking about the issues of video fakery in New York and so forth.
Yeah, and I was just briefly saying that when I bring this stuff up to people, I very often say, look, they faked those videos, and they did it in a number of ways. And it's actually easier to do it that way, the additional step of having fakery, than to risk having a plane missed if they're going to fake the whole event. By that I mean if they're going to create a lie. Because as John Lear has pointed out, GPS is too inaccurate to actually allow you to go into a building. So if you're going to do an inside job, it's actually easier to do this way, even though it sounds more complex. And if people say, "Oh, that's silly," I say, "Sorry, here you go." And I was going to go into this. They used no wake vortex. This is a brilliant observation by Ace Baker. Even a missile would have left a swirling in the air that the fire would have, combined around in the immediate aftermath of the flying object. Certainly a plane would, and it doesn't matter if he pointed out that fire and air don't mix, like the oil and the air don't mix, but they swirl together. And so a wake vortex is very important. So I wonder, if they did use missiles, they also covered that up with fake blasts. Or they didn't use missiles. That might be truth that's left in these videos, and I can't speak to that issue. I don't think we'll really know. But second of all, the planes go right in, and I explain that as I told you. And then I'd quickly say they also used composite images. When they changed their supposed viewpoint, nothing but the immediate foreground shifts. And you wouldn't see much of a shift in a very far away object. That's true. But you would see it in the near, sort of middle ground objects. And you certainly would with things like the Verrazzano Bridge and so on. You would not get that moving with the same proportion of anything in the foreground. If you moved enough to make something that far away move, then the things in the foreground would be noticeably moving, and they don't. And people just say, you're kidding. Oh, no, I'm sorry. So therefore, all those other arguments, the arguments about, how the heck did those buildings come down, they all take immediate significance. We've worked those out. People worked some of that out without knowing about the faking of the videos. And I've noticed it's been a huge fight to get this issue noticed. But just as with John F. Kennedy's murder, if you go past the film, suddenly all the rest of it a lot of it's been worked out. It was the film stopping you. In fact, in your book, The Great Zapruder Film Hoax, David Liston talks a lot about that in his article. He talks about how it took him a long time to really realize that the issue in the conspiracy wasn't that there was one shooter or two, or did Harvey Oswald do it or didn't it, but that if the films were faked, or, tampered with and even changed significantly, then there's a different layer to this conspiracy. They're creating a myth. They're tampering with evidence. They're doing all of that stuff. They're also obstructing justice by creating a new idea in your head. So once you've got the film out of your head, or these videos out of your head, then you can begin bringing them back. You can take, this may have been left in, or this was a mistake that it caught. They actually caught something that was still left in that we can reasonably assume from other things we know. And it also does help to have had the films to get some idea of, some of what it might have felt like to be there. There is that advantage to having the film. Beyond that, they're really not valuable for creating a picture of what happened. Not much anyway. And to put them out into the trash can and then bring little pieces back is the only way to really use the filmic evidence properly. Plus, of course, remembering, I do have some sense of Jackie in a pink coat and the blue limo and the green grass does give you a little bit of a feeling of being there. And those two combined, what you can glean from it and your initial impression of the feeling of the day, that's about it. You can't actually take what it implies about the day's events at all. You can't take it as good evidence for anything. So it's such a direct access into the arguments to throw out the visual realm that I think it scares people. I think it actually, it turns something in their head and they go, what?
Well, I think you're making a key point, Claire, because we are so dependent on our eyesight to obtain information about the world around us. I think we're something like 85% dependent upon vision for accessing information about our environment, and our other senses are given a quite, confirmatory or corroborative role. So if you throw out the visual evidence, then I think most of us kind of feel at a loss as to how to proceed.
And also, as I was saying, there's an emotional loss of, well, what did it feel like to be there that day? You can actually still use it as an emotional crutch to understand sort of, if I'd been standing there, something of this would have, this is sort of what New York looks like. It's sort of what those towers burning look like. And it's pretty awful to sort of see it. Beyond that, not useful. Actually, there's a wonderful quotation from Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, Goethe, the famous Enlightenment thinker in German. What is the most difficult of all things? What seems to you to be the easiest? To see with your eyes what your eyes are looking at. He could have said to see with your mind, meaning use your eyes and your mind when you're looking. And you're talking about that. We rely so much on our eyes, but we don't do actually a lot of our calculations with our eyes. Our minds are judging, actually. We're doing a lot of our judging with spatial relationships, and so we have to go back to these other senses and bring them together again. And it's a bit of an emotional shock. Can we switch gears entirely for a moment? You wanted to discuss a little bit about the Israeli connection, and I did want to briefly touch on that, maybe 10 minutes.
Absolutely. Go for it.
You've raised a number of wonderful points about potential Mossad witnessing, certainly those what they're called the Seven Dancing Israelis who were there to actually, they said on Israeli TV to document the event. And there are other, of course, more political connections that you can make to Israel having benefited from this event. And I want to point out that you're always stressing, of course, it's not Jewish, it's Zionist, it's not Jewish, it's Israeli. So that's again back to a really good point that when we're talking about conspiracy, there's one level where it's the nation, not the people, or it's parts of the government, not the whole government. Or we have to flip our lenses here and see that the government structures can be doing things when the people don't really see that. Even some of the people within those structures don't see what's being done. But there are a lot of websites that bring up these suggestions that talk Jewish, that it's the Jewish thing. And I want to address that a little bit. Again, back to the early point we were making about, is the conspiracy sort of potential, are the people who are conspirators drawn from the groupthink, or is it just a few bad apples that go crazy? It's usually people who are drawn from a groupthink. So, for instance, the mafia tends to be Italian, right? And so in one sense, if you're going to follow the mafia trail, you might want to look at first the Italian community, then find within it the people who are using Italian specialists or Sicilian specialists as something that they would use to justify a bad action. And among those, then, you would find people who might be conspiring to actually do awful acts. So on the one side, as a researcher, it helps to know what the group talks like and who their friends are, and it can happen within a religious group, it can happen within a national group, one sex, a race, and then to narrow down from there. So in that sense only, it's okay to say there's an Italian conspiracy, it's called the mafia, or there's an American conspiracy, it's called imperialism or whatever, or there's a Jewish conspiracy, it's called Zionism, and it happens in Israel. But it isn't, of course, actually from the other side, a whole truth. It's just that when you're going to look for the kinds of slogans, you're going to look for the kinds of people who might be funding it, the kinds of friends they have, they're likely to come from that group. The second thing, of course, is that group can be duped. So if you have a bunch of, let's say, Jewish or Italian or Christian, whatever, business people, their interests are both as business people and they are as Jews who think that Israel's great, and then they're also within them possibly duped to think that something they're funding will benefit themselves. We find this with Saddam Hussein, to switch topics. Obviously, their fellow was promoted. He was helped a lot, and then suddenly his other factional buddies turn on him. So the Jews, even the ones who are involved in loving Zionism, or the ones who love Israel as a country, and so on, who might fund various actions, can be duped by others who want something for Israel or want something for their banks in Israel, or whatever, that the Israelis don't want, or that the business people don't want. So you get factions upon factions, you get ideologies being used with other ideologies, and people turning on people, kind of like different factions inside a mafia. And so in that sense, it's really sad that some of these people don't keep saying there's what the Zionist thing is. The Rothschild bankers have their fingerprints all over Israel, all over the funding, and we know about bankers, and we know about the old ties with other bankers, and even with non-Jewish secret society stuff, which might make me sound kooky, but unfortunately it really exists. And so if you're thinking that way, you won't go and say it's a Jewish conspiracy. But when you're tracing who might be involved, and you find media owners being Israeli citizens or Jews who are proud, I mean, I think they're great. I think it's great that Jews have a presence because they can be a vulnerable people in any society. Just as I'd love to see more American natives, owning big business and so on. At the same time, they could be duped, or they could be fanatic, or they could be, it can be anything, and they will still be proud of it. They're using the slogans of for Israel and the Jews. So you have to follow those threads. It doesn't, of course, mean that it's really a Jewish or an Islamic or an American or a British. We've all been duped by these slogans, and then the power mongers among us can even be duped by each other. So I just wanted to bring that up. And I'm just going to make a mention that the ADL, I sent you a few links. The ADL had a number of pieces, the most important of which is a multi-page PDF they put out in 2003. And let me find it here. It was on 9/11 and that hurting the Zionists hurts the Jewish people because, of course, you might get fanatic things here. Now, let me see. I have to find it. Oh dear, it's an ADL PDF, and why can't I find it? Anyway, there's also, of course, they're now putting out pieces saying that these groups that are anti-government, they destabilize the government, like they're always calling them right-wing extremists, and they're lumping in 9/11 truth, and they're specifically mentioning Alex Jones, for instance. They're saying that if it's anti-government, it's bad for vulnerable people. That includes us Jews. So you better be careful about anyone who's saying the Mossad was involved in anything. And that shuts down, of course, whether the Mossad really was involved. And
that's ironic, Claire, because I don't think Alex Jones has ever gone there. Alex Jones talks about the Illuminati, the Bilderbergers, the Rothschilds, and all that. He does not talk about the Mossad or the Zionists.
I know, and that's the key, is that some of these papers they're putting out are about destabilizing the government is bad for Jewish people.
It's called free speech, for God's sake, I mean, these are becoming such monstrous dictators because they're trying to insulate, Israel and the Mossad from any discussion or criticism. I mean, how many times do we have to hear about the Holocaust, for God's sake? I mean, I'm sick of it.
I know, but of course it was awful, and there are weird. I have to get back up because there's so many things. It's almost like you get a lot of thought to the same point. You can't get them all out at the same point.
Well, I think your idea that they're going to try to suppress free speech and the internet. I mean, there are all these possibilities, and they're all extremely threatening. And it's looking less and less as though Obama is the beacon of light and liberty and strength and change. I mean, the whole situation is terribly, terribly unsettling, distressing.
It's actually downright frightening at that level. I mean, I have literally shaken in my shoes a few times and had people say, well, it is going that bad, but it's not really that bad. And again, this is kind of like that conspiracy thing. Is it big or is it a few bad apples? It's both. There are bad apples that fight with each other and they cause widespread effects. There are also, of course, factions that think they're getting some benefit. They're agitating for some effect. And they're not directly necessarily all the time being told what to do by the highest bad apples. I would think Hitler didn't have to tell his goon squad exactly what to do. Once he set up a sort of a sadistic thing, a lot of things will begin happening because people will begin doing them. But I did want to say, on the ADL worried about the anti-government stuff, it's adl.org/main_extremism/ oaths_keepers_3_percenters.htm. What they're warning about is the militia group.
Claire, it's easier to get there without the URL. Just give us the title of the thing that will get us there on a Google.
I think it's Oath Keepers 3%ers. You could Google that on adl.org. There was also, of course, a paper that they put out called Anti-Semitic 9/11 Conspiracy Theories Still Abound. And what they're saying, and here it is. I think terrorism, and there's another one. Terrorism Strikes America. What they are saying, they're upset that Jones said that Bin Laden was a known CIA asset. They don't say, of course, that he attacks the Jews or the Zionists. What they're mixing two things in here. They're saying destabilizing the government by dissent. That you have this government you cannot dissent with. And that's bad for any vulnerable.
I thought that was the whole idea of the United States, was that you're free to criticize your government. I mean, where is this poppycock coming from? Other than, of course, obviously, to preserve this insulation of the Israel and the Mossad from any criticism on anything.
Well, that's it, and that's even one low level. Like, it insulates Israel and the Mossad, but at a higher level, it insulates the funders, backers, and controllers. To what degree they do that, and they don't do it all the time on all issues, of Israel and the Mossad, who are also influencing the British, and they're also influencing the Americans, and they're also in. So there's people behind the scenes. And these groups are, the lower levels of them, of course they're worried about real hate crimes. There is that level. But out comes this stuff. And this is only one mouthpiece, one organ of keep the establishment so and don't ask any questions. And always interesting to look at who created the ADL. It was the B'nai B'rith. Who created the B'nai B'rith was Mazzini. And he's linked back in the 19th century to all these young Italy, young Germany, young Russia, young America, and young Israel, and all these groups. And he was working, with problems. He thought he was helping create a new order for the world that would be peaceful. And he was working with Palmerston, Lord Palmerston, who wanted the British Empire to expand and to be everything. And who are they working with? The bankers. So it's actually, one factor of a factor of a factor, and it takes on its own life, and it has. This is why I'm saying we have to put on different lenses for different purposes of discussion. And then to just move off the ADL for a moment, I'm going to go back to Michael Parenti. He speaks in that same talk where he said, would you call a Holocaust student of the Holocaust a Holocaust buff or not? No, you wouldn't. It's a serious issue. This is horrible stuff. So you shouldn't call people looking at all conspiracies or all negatives as buffs or not, because I brought that up in context with you. But the other side of it later in his talk, and it's called JFK and the gangster nature of the state. This is his talk. He gave it on the 40th anniversary of John F. Kennedy's murder. And he refers to, you might know this article, I think it was Washington Post, or it was New York Times, a fellow who was a columnist, not a movie reviewer, was given the task of reviewing the John F. Kennedy movie by Oliver Stone. And of course, this movie was put down 6 months before it came out. I mean, it's a very obviously a put down thing. But this article came out, and this columnist, not reviewer, got an entire page with pictures and stuff. And in it, he of course slightly puts down all of the facts. And at the end, he says, if these things are true, the danger is that knowing them would destabilize the state. So, and Parenti makes this key point. He says that's always the issue. The issue isn't whether they're true, and we could correct the state that patriots question 9/11 or question the murder of JFK or question Mossad attacks or anything. What the issue always is for these writers and these shills and these agents is don't question it because it'll destabilize the state. Be happy that the state's still functioning. And the ADL is doing a similar thing. It's saying if you question these things, you're risking the Jewish people by destabilizing the state. It's still about destabilizing the state instead of about getting truth and restabilizing the state on a better footing. And I think Michael Parenti's point is brilliant, that's the key issue here. If you're not nutty for asking, then you're just wrong for asking because you're hurting everyone's pretty little life. And I do walk out there on the streets and I think things look kind of normal most of the time. But I now know there was no normal. It's not normal. And things are going on that will affect my life. There's a war that I'm not part of. And as you pointed out, if we had the draft, wherever people might take more interest in what wars we were part of. But it would also go back to sort of like in the early 60s where people had to go to these things and die when they didn't actually agree with it. But I think these things are not normal. It's not normal to have assassinations. It's not normal. It's usual. It's not normal. It's happening all the time, and it's getting worse. But it's not normal. So I think we've got to bounce ourselves out of the idea that just because things look nice, that we should keep them as they are because at least it's happening to someone else, not us, because it does come home to roost. And John Perkins, the writer of Confessions of an Economic Hitman, said that, and actually in an interview with Alex Jones a month ago, he said, look, I wrote that book, we were followed by the hitmen. We were the first push, but we were followed by the hitmen, and it's coming home to roost. He doesn't mention it's been there for a long time, but I just think that the idea that we shouldn't question these things because we're okay, why make it worse by opening that can of worms? And the ADL is doing that, saying that the Jews will be hurt.
Well, it's a form of it's a form of cancer on the body politic, Claire, and the longer you allow the corruption to endure, the worse it becomes. And anyone who thinks, that what you don't know won't hurt you is, unlike me, never suffered from cancer because, once you discover it, you can cope with it. Once you realize the truth about these things, you can do something about it. You can excise the cancer and, as Parenti suggests, restabilize the state at a higher level. That's absolutely essential. It's called reform.
And I at a higher level.
It's a form of reform rather than revolution.
Exactly. Well, it's a different definition of revolution, one of many that are valid. But and so the ADL and also black rights groups and women's groups and anti-war groups and people banding under Obama, and you know some of my opinions on Obama, and I wrote a little thing on one of your blog posts there listed on radiofetzer.blogspot.com, where these podcasts from this radio show are on, and I put a few posts in which I responded to a really great guy. I'd like to thank him, Blogmaster152, whoever he is, for making a comment to you that if we're banding together under less cover, as Tarpley calls it, that this is for the good of everybody. We've got to have this work for the good. Or we can't question the blacks. We can't question the women. We can't question the men. We can't question. Well, then ultimately, what kind of a society do we have? First of all, we're dumb. We're just dumb. And second of all, we can't actually air any real help for each other, because the minute you name them and you say, "Oh, you're Jewish, you might have a problem. I'd like to help you with, if somebody's hurting you." "Oh, you just called me Jewish." Like it gets to that point, or you called me black, or you called me. People can't even reach out to one another for fear that they might be offending someone by referring to some aspect of their nature. And you may not be a bigot. You may be a person who's just trying to actually name some problem, and we have this going on. And I just wanted to point out to you that, yes, this hate crimes bill is something that the ADL was very proud of. They said they say on their own site from a New York Times article under ADL hails overdue enactment of hate crimes legislation. You can Google ADL hails overdue enactment. You'll get it. It's on their site. It's a repost of the New York Times article in which they say they're very happy. They worked very hard. And there are legitimate uses for bullying problems. I was bullied horribly as a child. I know what that is. But why are they then talking about having a stable universe and not questioning the state? Well, that's not going to actually help bullying be undone, because the biggest bullies remain. So I'm all for, helping people not have bad actions against them, but some actions against us all, and they're coming in from the very top, as well as the middle, and if these groups don't recognize that, they're shooting us all in the foot by saying, you get this on some black sites, you get this on some anti-war sites, don't question Obama, give him patience. Michael Moore started to question it, and his wife told him not to, and said, well, give him time. Well, how much time and how many more troops and how much more continuity of government and Patriot Acts and renditions and, how much more of this torture. Oh, just before we go, I know we have like 1 minute.
No, we have 6. Claire, we have 6.
Oh, I'd like to just briefly recommend to everyone the movie The Men Who Stare at Goats. It's been panned by reviewers. My boyfriend almost didn't want to go see it. I said, let's go see what they did with this. And the story is roughly about the remote viewing, the psychic warrior stuff that went on in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and how it was done. But the reviewers were pissed off that it wasn't about more about the weird stuff, and the movie is actually really about bringing it to the now, and the character in the now witnesses the torture, and he tries to do a different action because of what he knows. And this is what we need to do. We need to bring our knowledge out there to people. And I say to people who are rabidly angry about this and so upset, and like little mad dogs, I feel it too. But there are times when you cannot tell people what you know about these horrible things. Instead, what you do is you suggest a line of questioning. Or you say to a union, let's say, I think that there's a bigger issue than just our particular plant closing. I think we should also be calling for a Tobin tax on securities, because that's the big thing. You can add programmatic suggestions into people's lives without their knowing how you got it. You actually got it by getting these other horrible things hit straight in your mind. They don't have to know that, and because they might react to you. You want the best possible action. Not everyone's open to hearing about assassins and so on. So you can add wisdom from what you know without even telling people about 9/11 and JFK's murder. And you've done something for the world in this crisis. And that movie, The Menace There It Goes, it's flippant at the end. It really, really botched that. It's got a cutesy side, and it stayed cutesy, and I didn't like that. But if you take the cutesy out of the ending, it's what we're all called to do. We're called to actually recognize how bad this has become. And they even have the Barney clip, how the torture was. They said, they're not being tortured, they're just being played the Barney song for 24 hours. That's in the film. They talk about MK Ultra. They talk about mutilating people, but Kevin Spacey shuts the guy up real quick. But it's in there. So I suggest to anyone who knows this stuff to have a look at it, because it actually shows you a success story. And it feels good to those of us who know to see a success story and to see that it is possible to have good outcomes, because we're carrying all this wisdom. And how do we bring it out there? When they have to not bring it directly, we have to bring it in appropriate suggestions. And I work for a company where we work with charities, and we had the Canadian Civil Liberties Union come in, and they were talking about the taser issue in Canada. And I didn't tell everyone I knew things. I just said, excuse me, now I've heard, I acted all innocent, I've heard that there are crowd tasers with multiple tasers on them that are at different strengths from regular tasers, and they're going to be promoted in the fall. Are you doing any actions on that? And what I had done there is educate all the people in the room, bring them to a deeper level, and also educate the Canadian Civil Liberties Union. And the guy said, didn't know about that. We'll have to look into that.
Claire, I got to say...
And I didn't mention John F. Kennedy or 9/11.
I think tonight you've brought us all to a deeper level. And I can't wait to have you back. This has been brilliant. And I thank you. I thank you.
You too, Jim. I cry sometimes when I'm listening to these people because I'm so happy that they've done their work.
Claire, I'm going to have you back. You're wonderful. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much.
You too, Jim. Love ya.
Terrific. Me too. Bye now. Jim Fetzer, your host on The Real Deal, thanking my special guest, Clare Kuehn, who has brought us all to a higher level tonight. Thank you all for listening.